What's up, guys? All right, going over mistake number 5 that I see in the preparation for uh, the Open, or really just any program in general, at least as far as the fitness community goes, is what I see. And it's interesting because this is actually kind of the foundation of CrossFit and what they say. They say mechanics come first, and then you can progress into intensity. Um, but we tend to say that and not really practice it. So I want to kind of talk about how we should be practicing that and in our training programs. So there's a couple different areas I like to break this down to movement quality. So what's limiting your movement quality? Is it mobility? Is it stability? Is it just simply technique? Or is it just pacing? Maybe you know how to move properly, but your pacing is just all out of whack, and so you can't hold that movement quality later in the workouts. I always reference him, but a perfect example of this is Rich Froning. He's the top in the world. Um, Now, I guess you have to say arguably the top in the world, but he moves perfectly, and there's a reason for that. All of the people at the top move really, really well. So when we're looking at this, the problem with this is we like to get in there and we like to work hard. We like to lift heavy. We like to go hard in our metcons, and then that only leaves certain energy and time for focusing on movement quality. So it's got to be integrated into our program. So we can't, or we can, but it's hard to separate it out to where we have maybe an hour training session, and then we're supposed to be doing another hour or so of mobility work on top of that, with passive stretching, with structural balance work, with all the work that my chiropractor's given me, and the stretches that Ramwad's given me, and all these different things, and performance care and things like that, that all these different things layered on it, and we simply don't have time to do all that stuff unless you're a professional exerciser, and unfortunately a lot of us don't have the luxury of doing that. So how can we break this down and give us the biggest bang for our buck when we're focusing on this, and what do we need to be focusing on? So first of all, you need to figure out what's limiting your movement quality. So what's the movement that you break down on? Why do you break down on that movement? Sorry, I squeaked. If it's overhead squats, is it really mobility, or is it stability in that overhead position? What's breaking down? In chest bar pull-ups, is it mobility maybe that's restricting you from getting that in range of motion at the top, or is it strength and stability in the shoulders and the scapula that's causing problems in that position? So first you have to look at that, whether that's a coach looking at that for you, or a healthcare professional looking at that for you, but figure out what is limiting you. Then you can prioritize where you're going to put your time, because for more than a lot of people, mobility is not necessarily, passive stretching is not necessarily where they need to be spending a lot of their time. Now, if you obviously have passive range of motion limitations, then obviously you have to put your time in there, and you have to put a lot of time in there, because it takes a long time for that stuff to come back through, or to come back. And so there's some deeper practices that we can use, whether it's functional range conditioning stuff like pails and rails or cars. If you're not familiar with that, don't worry about it. Whether it's PNF stretching, whether it's gymnastics bodies type of stretching, whether it's Ramwad, all those things are good resources, but you have to figure out what you need to be prioritizing in your stretches. Active and weighted stretches, I like these a lot. They are taxing, but you can break it down to where passive stretches, if you do 2-minute stretch on your hamstring once a week, that's probably not going to do very much. But if you do a little bit more intensive stretch, like a specific hamstring routine that takes maybe 30 minutes, then you can do that once a week, and that'll be enough for you. Active weighted stretching, you can do that less often. So like I said, the Jefferson curl is one that I've mentioned. It's a hamstring stretch and kind of a low back stretch. Be very cautious with it, because it is a weighted, rounded back kind of RDL per se. But weighted stretches are really good. They strengthen the position, so they don't just gain the new range of motion, but they strengthen the position that we're trying to get. So that's where stability comes in. Stability is a big factor, because if we just gain the new range of motion passively, then all of a sudden we have this new range of motion that's never been trained before, and so the strength in that position is not going to be very strong. So we have to be doing stability work and structural balance work to balance that out. So if I gain new range of motion in my scapula and my thoracic spine for that overhead squat, but I don't strengthen that position and the shoulders retracted, kind of good posture position, I'm just going to fall right back into this position. I'm going to always have to work on opening up that posture. So structural balance work, physical therapy work, when I think of that, physical therapy type work for structural balance is things like TheraBands for the shoulders, external rotation, all those kind of small movements that kind of recruit and train and strengthen those really small muscles, rotator cuffs or the glutes with like banded X walks and things like that. All those kind of really detailed isolated movements are really good for certain times and certain populations. I would say, one, figure out exactly what you need to be working on. What's the small muscle group that you need to be training? And if there's something specific that you definitely need to address, then you need to be addressing that until that weakness is shored up. If it's just something you're doing to stay healthy and to stay on top of it, then I would say go more physical therapy based and the more off season it is, and more functional movement based the closer to the season it is. So functional movement based, let's say we have problems with shoulder overhead stability. So in the off season, we may be doing things like dumbbell external rotation, power raise, even bottoms up kettlebell carries. I mentioned that in the functional training, but it could be a PT kind of halfway in between. Little things like that, crossover symmetry. All that stuff is kind of physical therapy based. That could be more off season, and as we progress into closer to the season and we start really getting some intensity in that overhead position, we want some more. We want to put more intensity on that movement. Then we move into overhead carries with kettlebells or dumbbells, overhead carries with barbells, overhead carries with yoke carries. So that's more functional based because it directly relates to handstand push-ups, to snatches, catching a snatch overhead, to catching a jerk overhead. Those dumbbell external rotation, power raise, things like that are going to help with that as far as pain and injury prevention goes, but they're not going to help just a ton with the actual load that you're going to be able to put over your head. So we need to move that into more functional based training. When you're doing the small movements, the physical therapy based movements, you can do a little bit before as activation, but not a ton. You don't want to fatigue it. You just want to activate it. And then if you really have a weakness and you need to actually train it, then you want to do that after your workout. Because if we wear out and fatigue the small muscle groups before the training, then when we go in to put that heavy barbell overhead, we're going to be weaker because those small muscles aren't there to stabilize the shoulder. So do your fatigue, do your actual strength training for those small muscle groups after you're done with your main training. Skill development. This can be my favorite way to kind of do this is just an EMOM. So when I say skill development, I don't want to think about like getting your first muscle up or getting your first kipping pull up. Like I'm talking about movements that you can do, but you need to always be focusing on mastering the movement. So something Greg Glassman always says, do the common uncommonly well, that level of virtuosity in our movement. So how often are we practicing front squats? How often are we practicing thrusters, regular push-ups, kipping pull-ups, ring push-ups, dips, basic movements like that, even wall balls, things like that. How often are we practicing the skill of that movement to make sure that movement is perfect, which means we're fighting against ourselves that much less. So if our movement quality is not perfect, then some of the reason that we're breathing so hard during these workouts is because we're fighting against ourselves. So the better we can get in these movement positions, then the better our engine is going to be all of a sudden, and the stronger we're going to be all of a sudden because we're not fighting against ourselves the whole time. I like to do this in kind of EMOM fashions where maybe it's 3 thrusters at 70% per minute for 10 minutes and you're focused on perfect movement. Maybe it's snatch. Maybe it's one snatch at 65 to 80% per 45 seconds for 12 to 15 reps, and you have a 2-second hold in the catch position of the snatch, and you can't increase the weight unless you don't stutter step and everything hits perfectly. Only then can you go up and weight. So it's not a max effort training day, it's a skill development day. That can be, you can put that into a little bit of a fatigue based setting where you do maybe 1,000-meter row and then 10 thrusters at 50%, but you're focusing on perfect movement quality. You're not focusing on just simply getting through it as fast as you can. Then as you get closer to the season, you can put it in kind of sport specific scenarios. So maybe we do 3 sets with full recovery of 10 toes to bar, 15 power snatches with 95 pounds and 20 calorie bike. Rest, full recovery. The goal is to figure out how can you do it the fastest. So a lot of times you'll find that the when you try to go as fast as possible, it's slower than when you try to move as perfectly as possible. So if I move better on my toes to bar and better on my snatches, it may be faster than when I just try to rush through it. And I feel like I'm going faster, I'm more out of breath, but yet my time is slower. So that's another way to develop that skill development in a sport specific setting. And then pacing. One, just simply pacing on the front end appropriately. If it's 20-minute AMRAP, you know you can't go all out in that first 5 minutes. But secondly, and kind of more importantly, what I want to talk about is knowing yourself in different movements and how you need to pace different movements. Some people move better in a squatting, knee bending, knee flexion motion. Some people move better in a bending, kind of hinging pattern. Some people do better with upper body pulling. Some people do better with upper body pushing. You need to know how you pace, how you need to pace each workout appropriately. So if I know that I can do 20 unbroken muscle ups, but I know that if I do big sets of muscle ups, I kind of break down a little bit more, then I know that in the open workout comes up, I need to stick with 3 or 5 reps at a time. A good example of that is the overhead squat chest to bar pull-up workout. I'm fairly good at overhead squats and fairly good at chest to bar pull-ups, but muscle endurance is not great for me. I'm a short, compact athlete, so 5'6", relatively short arms, so the movements themselves aren't super taxing. But when I do big sets, my breathing gets a little bit out of control. So I simply did singles on that until on the chest bar pull-ups and stayed unbroken on the overhead squats until I got a little bit deeper into the rounds. And I had a top 50 score on that when that workout was up in the open, top 50 score in the open or in my region, doing it that way. And when I got to the big sets, then I started doing bigger sets. So I knew if I did bigger sets early on, I would get to a point where when I needed to really dig, I wouldn't have the muscle endurance to get into that next round. So just some things to think about there. Hope that helps. Let me know if you have any questions or more thoughts on this stuff. I am going to come back with a bonus video going over a little bit more of the density stuff that I mentioned yesterday and how to set that up. So hope this helps. Let me know if you have any questions. If you missed videos 1 through 4, then just reply back to this email and I'll get those to you as soon as I can. Have a good one.